Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into one of history's absolute weirdest and, honestly, most misunderstood conflicts. It's a story you think you know. Man versus beast, military versus nature, a tale that's become a legend online. But what if I told you that the story, the meme, is only a tiny piece of the real picture?
You've probably seen this quote, or some version of it, in a meme. It's the killer punchline to a story about a national military being totally, utterly humiliated by a bunch of flightless birds. But is it true? Did Australia really declare war on emus and lose? Well, that's exactly what we're going to figure out. So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll get into the legendary story everyone knows and loves. Then, we're going to start peeling back the layers to see what was really going on. After that, we'll zoom out and look at the bigger picture, this decades-long conflict. And finally, we'll explore how this little historical footnote just blew up into a massive internet meme.
Okay, let's set the scene. To understand the legend, you have to picture this. It's 1932. The whole world is in the middle of the Great Depression. And for farmers way out in Western Australia, things were already tough, and they were about to get a whole lot weirder. A huge migration is happening. We're talking 20,000 emus pushed out of the dry interior heading for the coast. And what do they find there? An absolute paradise, an all-you-can-eat buffet of ripe wheat fields. For the farmers who were already struggling, this wasn't just annoying. This was a full-blown invasion that threatened to wipe them out completely. So the farmers are desperate. A lot of them are actually army veterans. They appeal to the government, to the Minister for Defense himself. And his grand solution? To send in the military? Well, sort of. He sends a small unit from the Royal Australian Artillery made up of exactly 2 soldiers. Yep, just 2 guys. And what kind of firepower do you give 2 men to face down a horde of 20,000 birds? You give them 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 bullets. Now, on paper, that sounds like a ridiculously unfair fight, right? Humans with machine guns versus birds. Should be over in an afternoon. Except it was anything but. The entire plan just fell apart almost immediately. The soldiers thought, okay, we'll herd them into a group, open fire, easy. But the emus weren't having any of it. They were like these feathered guerrilla warriors. They'd scatter in every direction, breaking up into small, fast-moving squads that were impossible to hit. And to top it all off, the guns kept jamming, and the birds, well, they were just unbelievably tough. This is where we get that incredible quote from the commanding officer, Major Meredith. He was completely baffled. He basically said that these birds were like walking armored tanks. He even wrote that if they had an army division that could take bullets like these birds, it could face any army in the world. They would just soak up the bullets and keep on running. It was a tactical nightmare.
And here's the punchline to the whole legend. After days of total frustration and using up thousands of rounds of ammo to kill maybe a handful of birds, the military just gave up. They packed their bags and went home. The media had an absolute field day, and the story was set in stone. The mighty Australian army was outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and defeated by emus. The emus had won the war. But of course, that's the story. It's a great story. But history is almost never that simple or that silly. So now, let's pull back the curtain and deconstruct this legend, because we need to separate the facts from the feathers. So first things first, and this is probably the most important question we can ask, was this actually a war? I mean, that one word is what makes the whole story so funny. And the answer, pretty unequivocally, is no, not even close. The official name for this whole operation wasn't a war, it was an emu cull. Really? It's just a formal term for large-scale pest control. And you know, this kind of thing has happened a lot in Australian history, with all sorts of animals. The only thing that made this one so weird, the thing that makes us remember it, is that they sent actual soldiers with machine guns to do it. So when you put them side by side, the difference is huge. The legend is this epic, embarrassing military flop. The reality? It was a messy, disorganized, but kind of sort of effective pest control job. The goal was never to achieve a glorious victory over the emu nation. It was just to scare the birds away from the wheat fields long enough for the farmers to get their harvest in. And this is such a fascinating way to look at it. We all love to joke about how Australia lost the war. But if you put yourself in the shoes of those farmers back then, you might have seen it very differently. Yeah, the whole thing was chaotic. And sure, they didn't kill very many emus, but just by being there, making a lot of noise, and harassing the main flock, the soldiers did what they came to do. They bought the farmers just enough time to save their crops, which in the middle of the Great Depression was a very, very big deal. Okay, so now let's zoom out, because this whole thing in 1932, it wasn't some bizarre one-off event that came out of nowhere. It was really just one small, very public moment in a much, much longer conflict between people and wildlife in that part of Australia. This problem with emus eating crops, it didn't just pop up in 1932, and it definitely didn't end there. As farms expanded, they were moving right into the emu's natural habitat, right across their ancient migration paths. So this created a constant simmering conflict that went on for decades and decades. And this is what the real war looked like. It wasn't fought with a couple of machine guns, it was fought with fences. We are talking about massive, state-sponsored projects to build these vermin-proof fences that stretched for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers across the land. The goal was to physically keep the emus out of the farmlands. This was the real front line, a war of engineering and exclusion.
And you can see how long this went on. After the military thing in 32, the government just kept trying different stuff. They made it legal to declare emus vermin. For about 15 years, they offered a bounty, cash for every emu killed. Later on, they switched to permits and even declared open seasons on them. That little military operation was just one experiment out of many they threw at the problem over 40 years.
The numbers really tell the story here. That whole famous war in 1932, less than 1,000 emus were killed. But look at the bounty system later on. Between 61 and 73, payments were made for over 52,000 emus. It's not even in the same league. The military operation that became a global meme was responsible for a tiny fraction of the total culling. In the grand scheme of things, it was barely a blip on the radar. So this is the big question then. If it was such a minor, statistically insignificant event, how in the world did it become this legendary international meme? And this is where the story pivots from being about Australian history to being about modern internet culture. There is this huge, huge disconnect. If you talk to a lot of Australians, they're like, the Emu War? What's that? Never heard of it. It's not something they learned about in school. To them, it's just this weird bit of trivia that the internet blew way out of proportion. But for the rest of the world online, it's treated like this pivotal, hilarious, and defining moment in Australian history. And this quote pretty much nails the modern view on it. The story has taken on a life of its own online. It's so much bigger now than the actual event ever was. It's been completely cut loose from its original context and has been transformed into pure entertainment. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense why it went viral. It has all the ingredients for a perfect meme. First, it's just wonderfully weird, an army versus birds. Second, you have a fantastic underdog story with the emus. And third, it has a simple killer punchline that everyone gets instantly. The birds one. You don't need to know anything about Australian history to find it funny, and that makes it incredibly easy to share. And that brings us to the final takeaway here. The story of the Great Emu War actually tells us a lot less about Australia in 1932, and a whole lot more about us, right now, in the 21st century, about how we find, consume, and totally reshape history. And it leaves you with a really interesting question. In an age where any quirky little anecdote can be amplified into a global legend, how many of the other true stories we see and share every day are really just the next great myths in the making?